Justine, and to our friends and colleagues in the Retreat Center collaboration. Really appreciate the opportunity to be with all of you today. I want to say Assalamu alaikum, and may peace and blessings be upon you and your families, your communities, the beloved people that you work with. It is the first day of Ramadan, which uh, is a blessing, and with often with blessings, as we know, come challenges. So it's these first few days I always find that are days of transition, of moving in to a different rhythm of life, moving into a different spiritual space. But I, I want to say that one of the things when I think of sacred time, and when I think of moments in our diverse sacred calendars, I tend not to see them as siloed or as something belonging simply to those who might be experiencing the ritual of them. For me, Ramadan, or the time of Passover that just went by, or the time of Easter that just went by, are opening points that are universal. They contain story and emotion and passion and love and action, which I'd like to imagine and see as accessible by all. So when I say Ramadan Kareem to you, that may the blessings of Ramadan be upon all of us. I mean that in not only a sincere way, but in the most inclusive way, because I believe that the times that we are living in and passing through, that these are blessed days indeed. And so my aspiration, my hope is that what Ramadan carries with it, a time for introspection, a time for emptying out and filling up, a time of changing the rhythm of things. And God knows we've already had our rhythms changed over the last 14 months. And so you can imagine ways in which Ramadan adds to that change in the rhythms of life, that those blessings will visit all of us. Today, we're going to be talking about stories, and particularly talking about storytellers. And I have a number of sort of caveats, but I'll begin with three. One is to recognize that the incredible expertise that is in this room. I see many familiar faces here, people who I've come to respect and love incredibly over the last 2 or 3 years. I know the incredible experiences, stories, wisdom that they carry. So I'm honored to be in the room with you, because I see you as mentors and teachers. All of you are engaged in leadership in whatever centers or spaces that you are part of. You have been telling the stories of your own centers, engaging with these difficult moments and times. And I want to acknowledge that. And I want to offer what's going to happen over the next sort of 75 minutes, really in the spirit of sharing my experience, and hoping that you will find something in it that is resonant, or that you will feel that you can engage with it, hack it, change it, challenge it, contend with it, affirm it. All those options and more are available to us collectively. So I do encourage that. And the final caveat is this, and I think I need to say it at the top. Um, I think all of us, and I'll put myself first, I don't speak for myself. I think I get real cynical sometimes when it comes to talk about storytelling. There's a lot of talk about storytelling. And in fact, in this world of storytelling, there is kind of there is a co-optation of the idea of stories and storytelling by late stage capitalism and all of its devilish agents. And frankly, the art of storytelling has largely become the business of storytelling. And in that, we find at times beauty, but we also uh, will often find manipulation, insincerity. We'll often find an attempt to understand the mechanics of storytelling in order to achieve a particular type of goal, which our ethics, morals, values may not be able to contend with. I think I need to say that at the top end, and I'll tell you why. Then we'll jump right in. Um, my very dear and beloved friend Baljit Sandhu is this incredible personality, but she works in the United Kingdom and has really founded a kind of a field of work around lived experience and then and what she calls knowledge equity. And she runs something called the Center for Knowledge Equity in the United Kingdom, which I encourage all of you to check out. And her contention is simple. There's and you know this in your bones and your experience, that knowledge is generated in a variety of different ways, in a variety of different spaces, by a variety of different people. And so often we haven't really um, honored, lifted up, or recognized that the lived experience of something is one of the most important and vital generators of knowledge and wisdom. But that knowledge and wisdom is often only recognized when well-funded nonprofits, well-funded civil society organizations, governments and state structures access that knowledge as necessary for free in order to meet a broader policy need or objective or something that they want to do. And so we find, and I found in my experience in the United Kingdom for 15 years and Canada and other parts of the world, how often communities who are dealing with challenge and crisis in the most innovative, profound, and interesting ways have their knowledge co-opted, taken for free, and put into systems, reports, etc., that don't acknowledge where they're coming from. And so when I would talk to my friend Baljit, with whom we shared a fellowship here at Yale, um, um, I tell you, when I started talking about storytelling with her, I was so surprised at how defensive she was and how almost aggressive she was about, like, I don't know if I can work with you on the storytelling thing. And I was like, what is going on here? And when she started kind of explaining, and we got into what we ended up calling in a seminar that we organized, the good, the bad, and the ugly of storytelling, we started to really kind of parse out that when we're entering into the storytelling space, actually we're entering into a deeply fraught space. And what I want us to just, I put that caveat out there because I want to keep that in mind as we speak about the idea of storytelling, and particularly about storytellers, because I think there are deep questions that and cautions that we should continue to have, and that I encourage myself to have as we engage. I also encourage you to engage with as open a heart as possible to some of the experiences that I'll share with you, and of course, to the stories that I hope we'll tell each other over the coming hour and 15 minutes or so. Also, please feel free at any point in time to interrupt, to unmute, to come in. I hate Q&A. I love conversation. So questions, comments, concerns, affirmation, doubts, those are all not just acceptable, because I have no right to accept or reject anything that you have to say, but I will say that they are most welcome. This is a space where those things are most welcome. So somewhere along the line, something's not computing, or something's really exciting you, the chat's there, but your voice is there, and your presence is here. So let me start by sharing your screen. I am using PowerPoint today, which I know is kind of clunky on Zoom, but we'll try to do our best. Unlike Oren and others, I haven't graduated to the high level apps of the Apple universe yet. Oh, all right, here we go. Um, I want us to think about the storyteller as change maker, and all of you are storytellers and all of you are change makers. So we're talking about you, we're talking about ourselves. I want to say one little thing about this picture, and I hope this picture will continue to reveal itself through the course of the presentation. These are the faces of some of the incredible young leaders. It's the only way I can describe them, actually. Young leaders that I had the blessing and the opportunity to work with in Jakarta, Indonesia, several years ago. Many of the faces in this group are faces now of friends of people who I consider my own teachers now, even though they're much younger than me, because they taught me so much, and in my continued engagement with them, they continue to teach and offer incredible wisdom. A lot of my own story today and talking about these issues around storytelling is going to be speaking about my work in Indonesia across the fault lines of interreligious violence. Um, and I hope that that experience will help sort of frame some of the conversations that we'll have. You know, from in the Islamic tradition and the Muslim tradition, poetry is so important. I grew up in a house where poetry was celebrated: Urdu poetry, Punjabi poetry, Farsi poetry, Turkish poetry. My father should have gone to art school and should have been a calligrapher and a photographer, but became an accountant. So after the ledgers were put away, a lot of reading and calligraphy and art and poetry happened in our house, and I'm forever grateful to my mother and father for creating a home for me like that. Fear is the cheapest room in the house, said the mystic and poet Hafiz to his friend. I would like to see you living in better conditions. You know, I love the idea of fear being like a room. It's not just something that's within us, it's something that surrounds us and something that changes the way in which we interact with the world. And for all of us, those of us who have felt particular fears, particularly in this last year and a half, in these last 4 years of the last political administration, and this time of the fight back against anti-Black racism, and this fight for gender justice and sexual equality, and this fight against anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, and this fight to rectify white supremacy and the results of patriarchy and the continued class divisions which are perpetuated by systems of oppression and exploitation. Um, Boy, those are all generators of fear, aren't they? And often our responses, rightfully so, fight, flight, or freeze to fear are necessary. We have to kind of stop to assess, protect, save. Those are all the things that the folks in this room do every day. But I think to myself, and I think about my own, particularly my own journeys over the last sort of 20, 25 years, particularly since 9/11, as a Canadian born, North American Muslim who became who considers himself also a very globalized, cosmopolitan creature. Um, I've often found that when I have been motivated by fear, it shows up a lot in my stories, but it also shows up in a eventually I would say shows up in a profound lack of imagination, or the point where the imagination comes to an end. And I think Hafez is just trying to tell us that we're going to deal with challenge and crisis, and you know, what are the things that are going to guide us, you know, into that world of challenge and crisis. And so I'd like us to maybe keep in the back of our heads the role of fear, and certainly the project that I'm going to talk to you about and experiences as we start to tell each other stories is has a lot to do with fear, and has a lot to do with fear of violence, and fear of being erased, and the fear of not being heard. But I want to begin with what's in a name. And I'd like us all to just take a moment and to think about the names of our particular spaces, institutions, retreat centers, gathering places. You all come from engagement with those gathering places. And I want to think about I want to ask you to think about the name. I want to ask you to think about the name of the places that you are coming from. So I see my dear friend and teacher Jean Richardson from Kirkridge. You know, the Kirkridge is as I've come to know it, as this amazing sort of name, and it has an origin. And I want you to think about its meaning. I want to think about the meaning of the name that belongs to your center. And then I want actually for you to think about one way in which you have been able to see or evidence the impact of that name. Maybe on you, maybe on those around you. What did knowing the origin of the name and the meaning of the name, what kind of impact has it had, and what has it meant to you? What has it meant to you? And I want to speak really in the first person here. What has it meant to you? And what I'd like to do, Justine, how many of us are there other than the two of us, Justine, on the call? I think we have almost an even number. This is very impressive.
We have 24, but I see Carol and Betsy are sharing a screen coming from the Code Center.
Yes. Okay. So their group can be a triad. So Justine, I wonder if we can invite everyone into dyads or two screens. And what I'd like each of you to do is we're just going to take sort of 2 minutes each. Tell us something. Tell in your dyads, in your pairings. Tell each other something about the origin and meaning of the name of the center, institution, space that you are coming from. And then tell a short narrative, vignette, if you will, of the impact that knowing the origin and the meaning of the name of your center has had on you. Any questions?
Almost all back.
Almost back. I see it. I think we're waiting on one more group, aren't we?
Right.
Yeah, there. Are we there? Are we there, Justine?
Yes.
Okay, great. Welcome back, everyone. I'd love to hear a few of you share your stories. Let's take about 3 if we can. Origin, meaning, and impact on you. I'll happy to take volunteers, or I'm very happy also to ask. So I'm going to ask Kitty. How are you, Kitty? It's nice to see you.
It's wonderful to see you, AR. Really, Ramadan Mubarak. I really wanted to be here on this day, thinking of you in Ramadan.
Thank you very much.
It's a blessed month for you.
Ameen. Kitty, share with us origin, meaning, impact.
Well, so our retreat center is a Stony Point Retreat and Conference Center, and it's because it's in Stony Point, New York, and the original property was a farmhouse property, and it became a center in 1949, and they weren't feeling very creative, I guess, so it was Stony Point Center, and that's what it's been. You can do some things with Stony Point. Most people mix it up with Stony Brook, which is Stony Brook University on Long Island. We are not on Long Island. And the impact of that. Do you mean on the name or on?
Well, on you as someone who's been so intimately engaged with this place, has the name come to mean something to you? You know, in terms of like, yeah, the impact that knowing its origin story has had, and that impact could be that it's really dull, and we've tried to make it exciting. You know, it could be that.
Actually, it is an actual place. So Stony Point is a promontory into the Hudson River at the north point of Haverstraw Bay, where the Hudson River ends up being over 2 miles wide. It's the widest part of the Hudson River. It's huge. And it was a very strategic point where you can look down and see the entire bay. So it actually does exist. There is a Stony Point there. Mostly I connect it when I think of the farm that we had and how the farmers would talk about, you know, Stony Point in Rockland County. And we always had, you know, harvest after harvest of rocks out of our wonderful soil. So
I love that image. I feel like there's one of those wonderful children's stories in the making, the harvest of rocks.
Yes, every year, without a doubt. You don't have to worry, rain or shine. They're right there for you to harvest at any time.
I love it. Thank you so much, Kitty. Naomi.
Right. Well, the Hermitage name, I've been here for 20 years now, and when I first came, I was not very versed in contemplative and silence and solitude. I had a little bit of experience, but over the years, being a place of hermitage, being a place that welcomes people for silence and solitude, that's the program, has really formed my soul into a hermitage. So it's made a deep impact on me.
When you say, Naomi, that it's created a hermitage in you, how would you describe that to someone? It's such a beautiful image. It really is, and I'd love to explore it just for a moment longer.
Right. It's that place deep within where there's a constant communion with the divine. Mm-hmm. And so it's a space. It's an open place, and it's like magic in Harry Potter, or like it's bigger inside than it is outside. So it's this large open space where I'm alone with the alone, but it's a communion with the divine.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm going to invite Chris Johnson. Chris, you're right in front of me. That's why, and I saw you nodding, so I felt something emerging there. So I hope you don't mind me coming to you.
Of course, thank you very much. So I'm Chris. I'm representing a place called Prairie Oaks Institute, about 40 minutes outside of Minneapolis. It's actually a fairly small place that is maybe 10 or 12 years old, that my wife and I co-founded on what was her ancestral family farm as a way. So we created a 501c3 nonprofit and so on. And we did so primarily as a way of preserving the farm, the land, from all of the pressure of the exurban development from Minneapolis pushing out and wanting to swallow the farm that had been in the family for her family for 110 years. And is very fragile ecologically, and very sacred space, as we all speak about our places. The name Prairie Oaks Institute conveys a couple of different things. One is what the land itself told us about itself and its history. It is in a place of convergence of what you might picture as the prairie grasses of the Midwest, as well as hardwood forest, and the two come together. They converge in this place. So Prairie Oaks is sort of literal, and also conveys that sense of that this is a place where people can come from across all sorts of all kinds of difference. So it's a place of convergence, environmentally and in terms of our own stories, the people who come. And then thirdly, Prairie Oaks is meant to signify the depth of the roots of prairie grasses can go down 20 and 30 feet. So going deeply inward, as well as stretching yourself broadly out into the world in the way that an oak tree would spread its branches into the world. So at least those three layers of significance and meaning. And the impact is hard to describe because it is so much a labor of love, as well as, I'll just honestly say, since we have no staff, is also can be quite a weight to carry. But the name rings true in all those different ways. It roots us in place and sends us out into the world in really beautiful ways.
Oh, Chris,
Thanks for
so
listening.
much. No, that's a wow. That's a powerful image. Claire Anderson, we're gonna close this story sharing off with your reflections.
Well, Siena Retreat Center is named after Catherine of Siena, who was a mystic in the Dominican tradition back in the Middle Ages, some century, 12th century, something like that, 13th maybe, in Siena, which is today in Italy. And she was kind of, she died early, probably because of anorexia, actually. She was the youngest of something like 16 kids, and wanted to live in part of her family home that was kind of like under the stairs or something, and so that she could have her space away. She also was very that deep sense of contemplation that she had also compelled her to do really bold things in her life. And she took risks that raised all kinds of eyebrows. And that melding of spiritual time away or contemplative time away and going out in the world and doing bold things is what roots our Retreat and Spirituality Center.
And Claire, how has that impacted you in terms of your work personally?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's probably something that actually impacts us in small ways all the time. I think it infuses so much of what we do. Like right now, I'm in the middle of putting together our program schedule, and I am conscious of having a balance or a whole spectrum of offerings. We also try to engage when people are here. We try to engage all aspects of who they are, and integration is a really important thing in what we offer. Spiritual guidance, spiritual direction, and our spiritual guidance training program. That's also a place where we see that it's a value that Fetzer holds too, the action and contemplation.
Mm. Oh, there was so much there I want to pick on in each one of those stories, but Claire, you almost were divinely led to a certain point in your story that I want to actually jump off from as we headed to exploring a particular fault line. Thank you so much for all of your sharing, and we're going to come back to this. I want this to be integrative. So as we're moving forward, think about it as concentric circles. Thank you, Diana, for as always the good tech advice. I will ensure that I full screen it so everyone can see well. Just give me one moment, and we'll be able to do that. Okay, great. I hope that's now nice and clear. And there's something that you said, Claire, that really struck me, and I have some notes here that I'd sort of been taking as we were heading into the session today, and it's kind of, it ties a little bit back to the dilemma and the struggle with storytelling, and particularly for you as retreat center leaders, founders, directors. You've probably heard, as I have, so much about things like narrative change, right? And this idea that once again, there are systems to the way in which we tell stories that that lead to change. And I think I've been forced to ask myself the question around narrative. I think narrative and story is important in terms of shaping and framing the ways in which we see the world. As or more important is the storyteller themselves. And I think for me, it is the individual, it is our capacity to tell stories, to engage in that human to human connection, to have empathy and compassion and all the things that we honor in our centers and ourselves and those around us. That for me is the engine of change. The story emerges from the manna of you and me and us, and who we are. But you said something, Claire, that really connected, which is that all of us are living the contradiction, aren't we? When Naomi or others speak about the space of silence, the space when we're alone with the alone, the opportunity for retreat itself and renewal. Of course, there's an element of that that's supposed to be about safety, but all of us know that actually being alone with the alone and engaging in retreat and facing ourselves is amongst the most risky things that we can do. It's almost like we want to be unsafe and enter into that risky space of contemplation, renewal, um, introspection, but want to do it in a place that will be held, and there'll be someone to catch us when we reach those difficult questions. And so the euphemisms abound: risky space, brave space, etc., etc. For me, it is about how we hold that risk, how we are courageous with one another, how empathy and compassion is amongst the most difficult things to do. And in a way, our retreat centers are spaces for all of this programming to happen, but ultimately they are going to be the repository. I'd like to imagine them, at least from my positionality, as a repository of generations of stories and experiences which feed and nourish that place. And some of those stories are going to be difficult. Some of those stories are going to be maybe even catastrophic. Some of those stories are going to be full of joy, but we're going to hold all of them, because all of those risky, difficult experiences are holding us. And Chris, you said, like, what does the land tell us? What does the land teach us? And we know from our indigenous siblings and teachers and ancestors how much that land holds. And in my tradition, in the Islamic tradition, we're told that when the time comes where all will be judged and adjudicated, and all the stories literally will be released from the earth. Every blade of grass and every rock and every patch of land will witness to the stories that took place on it, will witness to the histories. It always struck me as a young child when I was told that story about the end of days and the witnessing that would happen. And of course, that connects to that primordial wisdom that the land will teach us. And how do we access those stories before there are no more stories to tell? And so I want to honor everything that everyone has said and demarcate it from the buzzwords, because what you are doing and what your retreat centers are doing are so much more. And I would love for us and my colleagues in the retreat center collaboration hear me go on about this, is that how do we tell our collective stories? How do we tell the stories of these beautiful spaces, as Jean would say, these national parks for the soul? Each of the work that you are engaged in is giving something so profound. It's not a question of size. It's that spiritual impact, and is so vast. Is that how do we capture that and are able to take that story to others so they too can engage with it? And I think that's if I was to use the word narrative change, that's where I would use the word narrative change. How can we go braver and riskier in telling that story? And so this is all part of what I would call the storyteller's dilemma. What's my story? What's your story? What's our story? How do we make those connections? I used to work for my sins in the world of countering extremist and terrorist narratives. I did that for almost 2 decades. And I worked in places like Indonesia and Sudan and Pakistan, where speaking up against religious extremism and political extremism was a risky business in terms of one's life. And all the counterterrorism experts would always talk about, well, we need a better counter narrative. We have to better counter narratives. And so I after years in the field and working with communities and trying to find better ways of doing this work, because the work had to be done, and there were such incredible people and personalities who were, kind of working away on the ground, trying to find better ways to rebut political extremism and that was undergirded by religious messages. I really came to the conclusion that, along with my friend and mentor, the late Fuad Nahdi, that instead of countering narratives, we needed to tell a better narrative ourselves. Our stories needed to stand on their own as powerful and compelling, and that's a challenge. We often talk about, well, stories are about resilience and disruption and affirmation. Again, words that go into the kind of the buzz categories. But I think at the heart of it, I think what we're talking about in our stories is that indeed they demonstrate our ability to survive and thrive. They can also be ways that really do disrupt conventional thinking and ultimately should affirm the things that we share. It's this next point that I think many of you will connect to better than I will. My friend Mark Gonzalez, who's an indigenous and Mexican artist of Muslim faith, and now is in Tunisia with his Tunisian-born wife, setting up some incredible work there in the ancient city of Sousse. He often speaks, and in my work with him, and we worked a few years ago with Somali, the Somali diaspora and Somali creatives in the diaspora, and we were all, we were talking about story, and he said something that really is 12 years ago, and it stayed with me, that he would often speak to those who had faced trauma and speak to himself in so many ways about knowing that there was a time before trauma and there'll be a time after trauma. I know that most of our retreat centers have always been in a state of crisis. COVID isn't new. It's deepened it, perhaps. But we know that we struggle. We struggle in all kinds of ways. And I'm looking at, as one of my spiritual teachers says, I'm looking at mercy warriors on this call, warriors for compassion and mercy and love. And you've been doing that for decades. And there was a time before trauma. There was a time before difficulty. As Chris would say, the land tells us that there was that time, right? Of equilibrium, of balance, of love, of existing, of life. And therefore, there will be a time after trauma. There will be a time when we will come to that place again. We must be assured of it, that it is not the trauma that we live in, but the trauma that we live through. And to live in trauma, to quote Pope Francis, is almost like being a dog licking their wounds again and again so they remain open. Oh, it struck me when he talked about mercy and compassion in his book, God's Name is Compassion. He uses this example, and I remember it struck me. I had to put the book down because I resonated my own life so much, how much often I live in that moment of hurt, of pain, and yet ask for mercy. And Francis is telling us, move through it. How do we move through it? What are the spiritual resources, the community resources that we need? For me, that's so much about story, right? Because you have to communicate and assist you with by story, through story. How do we get through those difficult moments to that time afterwards, and to use story to imagine that time after trauma? What a powerful and important gift that the storyteller is given in so many ways. And then we always think about what's the goal of the work that we're doing. How how does it work? Does it stick? And so let me tell you something about a storytelling project I did in Indonesia. And Justine, I'm keeping an eye on the time. I am, I promise. Because I want to show you some stories that came out of it, and then I want us to move, hopefully, with the time that we have, into at least 2 story circles that allow us to continue to share and develop some of these ideas in 90 seconds. Indonesia, over the last few years, the most populous Muslim country in the world, an incredibly diverse nation. As I know most of you will know, an absolutely cosmopolitan, diverse, and messy country. The more time I spend in Indonesia, and I have a lot over the last 15 years, the more I am compelled by it, the more it excites me, the more I love it. When I land in Jakarta and I smell the air, or I land in Jogja and I go to my familiar haunts and my little hole in the wall cafes, and the same uncle is there who served me 10 years ago, I really feel like I'm coming home. Indonesia has had an incredibly violent history, a violent colonial history, the Dutch in particular, then a violent history in its transition to becoming a nation state. That violence has taken the form of violence against minority groups, Chinese, indigenous peoples, in some cases Christians, but in other cases Christian against Christian, or Christian against Muslim. This will be important in just a moment. There's this idea that there's agreed upon 5 principles, the Pancasila, that everyone agrees on. And it's quite a kind of ingenious way of devising a nation, but there's been a fracture of that. And so over the last few years, we've seen the rise of an Indonesian alt-right and alt-religious right, where politics and faith become messily entwined. Our own country is a proof of this, and how this kind of nefariousness happens. And because of that checkered ethnic, religious, and linguistic history, we've seen more acts of discrete violence against particularly religious minorities. And about 5 or 6 years ago, there was a spate of violent acts, particularly against Christian churches, but also Buddhist temples and Hindu temples. And it started happening not in smaller cities where minorities would have had a significant presence, but it started happening in the larger cities. It happened in places like Jakarta and Jogja and Bandung and Solo. And it was around that time that I and my colleague Stephen Shashua, who's the former director of the Three Faiths Forum in the United Kingdom and someone who I'd worked with very closely for many years, we met a colleague from Indonesia who Stephen was at Yale with at the time. And we started thinking about ways to take our own sort of experiences and ask ourselves the question. So we think we're so smart. AR, you work in journalism and storytelling. Stephen, you've spent the last 10 years, on the ground doing incredibly innovative interfaith dialogue work. Ima Abdul Rahim, you are in Jakarta, and you are generating the most fascinating and frightening research about interreligious relations in Indonesia. All you smart people, what are you going to do about it? And it was a challenge that we set for ourselves. And so Gene Wilder, as Willy Wonka, always helps transition us into what we can do. And so we came up with something called the Cafe Cerita, or the Cafe of Stories. Cerita in Indonesian language means stories. And we started thinking about how do we engage with difference in places where there has been profound acts of violence? And so we started thinking about what that would mean for us, right? Um, and so we looked at some pedagogies, which I'll talk about in a moment. But what we did was we reached out to 150 leaders. I need to qualify that word leaders. These were folks that the team, our amazing team at the Habibie Center in Jakarta, which was the local partner leading on this. We were supported as well by Google through the Tides Foundation, a very funny story, which I can tell you later. Probably the easiest grant application I will ever have in my life. It was like being at the right place at the right time with the right person signing a check. And you know, thank God for that. 150 leaders, 30 leaders in 5 conflict cities. In each city, 15 of those people were Muslim, and 15 were from other faith communities and none, representing a variety of ethnic traditions, which the ethnic traditions were right across the group. And what was really fascinating to us about the young people that we engaged with, and most of them were young, most of them were under 30, and we had a few exceptions. These were people working, like, you know, when you talk about the grassroots, they were basically working at the roots. I mean, some of these hadn't seen the grass. They were, I mean, in cities like Jakarta, where I hope you have a chance to go. One thing that you realize within 3 or 4 hours arriving is that there is this really interesting culture of the street. There'll be a neighborhood and the streets are all numbered, street 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Each street has its own identity. It's so interesting. It has its own soccer club. It has its own little team. It has its own community cafe. It has its own circle of mothers. It's got its own little school and preschool. It's amazing. And the work that happens in that street is so powerful. And there's such a sense of solidarity. And so what we were finding was these incredible people, women and men, and the groups were almost 50-50 in terms of male female. And we had several of the leaders who attended who were also self-identified as transgendered. And so they came into this space really, actually, a lot of them living in the same city, but not knowing each other at all. In fact, connections between the participants were very few. And that also made us realize that when we're speaking about cities of 10 or 15 million people, we're talking about huge ecosystems with lots of micro ecosystems. And this is where these people were having their impact. Many of those young people who were particularly from non-Muslim backgrounds were associated with communities or had been associated with communities that had experienced violence or the disruption of their places of worship. And so what we wanted to do was we wanted to find a way that they could not just encounter with each other, but the ways in which they could tell new stories of what it was like to live in that city, in the island of Java, and in Indonesia together. And one of the amazing things about Indonesia is that the sense of being Indonesian is really profound. It's almost like there might be ethnic, linguistic, and other divisions, but the sense that one belongs to this place, that doesn't change, that one is Javanese. And it was remarkable how powerful that glue was when it came to those difficult moments. And so we used 3 strategies. I'll go through them quickly because I want you to see the stories. We used the story circle, similar to what we did this morning and similar to what we're going to do in the latter half of our time together today. This is our little soft launch poster. I thought I'd treat you to our in-house design team's work. And the coffee motif is because I'm obsessed with coffee, and I believe like coffee houses are, like Habermas said, you know, the first great public square. And so the idea was that we held all of our events in cafes. They were the equivalent of our retreat centers. Those cafes, those community spaces. I mean, we were inundated with cafes that wanted us to have them, wanted to host us rather. They wanted us to use the place. They wanted to feed us. They wanted to give us coffee all day and that lovely, sweet, you know, Javanese coffee blends. And they wanted to give us them. Why? Because these cafe owners really saw themselves as community spaces, and actually of spaces, as we learned from many of our participants. One of our participants, a trans participant from Yogyakarta, told us that they had found refuge in cafes, that at the most difficult point in their lives, they had come to the cafes. And there was one cafe in particular that they had come to that gave them not just a refuge and sustenance, but just space. And it was powerful to see the ways in which cafes were operating, for in these young people's lives. So the cafe was the right place to go. And of course, the story circle, we all know it. It's the oldest, to quote my friend Mark Gonzalez, the oldest empathy technology, right? It's the oldest human impulse. Sit around the hearth, share food, listen to one another. So many of you here are trained in using the circle, and it's primordial. It's part of the way in which the human spirit operates, is the circle. And to really think of it, I think where people like Mark Gonzalez and others take it forward is to think about it as an empathy technology, as a way, right, as a mechanics of building empathy and compassion with one another, of entering into unsafety, the risk of sharing in the most safe way possible. And so story circles became a very important pedagogy. And I want to remind us that, and remind myself and bring to mind again the fact that it was the story circles that became a core part of the freedom movement. Before the March on Selma, or before the actions in Birmingham, Alabama, or in Chicago, or elsewhere, it became a tradition of the freedom movement to sit down. When you read the words of Fannie Lou Hamer or others, what were they doing in those churches? Praying, but they were sitting together and sharing what the day would look like, stories of where they came from, what motivated them to that place. The story circle became an empowering tool, intentional tool of gathering and of building solidarity and sharing. And so we really employed the story circle in our pedagogy in a formal way, but also an informal way. Like when disagreements would come up or other things, we'd break off into story circles. And we try to, and when we say story circle, what we're saying is we have a problematic before us. What are the stories in my life and experience that are going to speak to that moment? And so we prompt them to speak to that moment. Sometimes the stories and the challenge might seem, the relationship might seem a bit oblique. But actually what we're doing is we're trying to find the manna of our own experience and presenting it as a gift to others, which is what we're beautifully doing within that story circle. Moving very quickly. Like some of you in this room, I've been trained in the theater of the oppressed, models of Augusto Boal, bringing the pedagogy of the oppressed of Paulo Freire to life, quite literally. And so we used a lot of theater of the oppressed, particularly image theater, using tableaus and going into creating these creative pictures with our own bodies. And the power of the tableau was that even the shyest participant could shape their bodies into something and be supported by the circle as they were doing so. And so this is a picture from Yogyakarta of a particular tableau or image theater. But we used image theater a lot, and we used the games. Many of you know the book Augusto Boal's Games for Actors and Non-Actors is almost like a religious text for me. It sits on the shelf. I know exactly where it is at any given time. I feel like I need some inspiration to get a group moving. I just take Augusto off the shelf. And sometimes I open up random. You kind of say Bismillah, and you kind of open up random to a page, and all of a sudden, Augusto and his community's wisdom kind of pours out and said, that's exactly what I needed. I just needed that game. And it's those games, there's joy, but those purposeful games that Boal plays. and helps us understand. And I was lucky when previous life was a high school history and drama teacher that my mentors had been personally trained by Boal. So I feel like I have like a lineage to Augusto. God bless him. So we used a lot of the theater of the oppressed. And finally, you know, we used the good old fashioned Marshall Gantz public narrative stuff. And you know, there's a lot of critiques of Marshall out there. I had the privilege of doing an intensive course with Marshall Gantz a few years back. And you know, you've all heard it in some way or the other, telling the story of self, and how do you connect that to the story of us? And once you've connected to us, how do you tell the story of now? What are we going to do with that sense of us? What I love about this, I'll tell you what I love about it. What really I resonated with Gantz's work was that, one, it was founded and it emerged out of activism. It emerged out of the freedom movement. It emerged out of Cesar Chavez's farm workers movement. It emerged out of experience. And I appreciate that about Marshall. The second thing I appreciate about it is that it emerges from Marshall's own deep reading of his Jewish heritage and Jewish wisdom. And I really appreciated that when I was studying with Marshall Gantz, is that how deeply he is affected by text and by the sacred. And I really appreciated that as a believer, as an activist, as a would-be organizer. I appreciated the way that he and the women and men around him were integrating their spiritual heritage and lineages into their work. Like it meant something that wasn't just lip service. And I could see the way in which he was drawing back into text that was so important. And so I think there's something here. I know many people have done the Self, Us, and Now work. I'd love for us to, if you haven't, I think it's just a good thing to do. And maybe we can do it together one day. And it's very structured. It's very structured. It's timed. It has a whole system. I'm very happy to share the resources with you, and I'll make sure, Justine, I get those to you. Marshall is very good about public source as long as you attribute. That's all he's ever asked for. And so it's there, and I'll be very happy to share that with you. All righty. I want to share two stories, and then I might not share the third one, but I want to jump into a story circle, at least one before we go, because I talk too much. That's the problem. Justine, you have to tell me that I'm being too verbose.
Hey, I just want to say that you are a storyteller that I think we're seeing it live out in action. So
I
that's
appreciate
wonderful.
that.
I see people nodding their heads as you continue.
So I want to tell you the story of two of our participants. These are students who are acutely aware of this growing fault lines between particularly religious groups. They are also keenly aware of violence, and many of them have experienced violence themselves. And many of them have seen their own places of worship attacked or closed down. And yet they're coming into this risky space with courage and bravery to tell each other stories. So two of our, in a group, you always know it, in a group, there's people who sparkle. And we were so lucky to have so many sparklers. But these two, Ray and Jan, sparkled them. They lit a little bit brighter, I knew the moment I met them in Jakarta, on the first day of our training, I'm like, I want to get to know them. Because there's just something about it. They were so kind. They came in the room. You could see them. They didn't even know people. They were matching up people. They were bringing people into the conversation. They were serving food. They had this wonderful light to them. And so we said, let's put them together into a group, because we would choose our groups. And so we put them together. And as they started working on their story of selves, and they started working on their story of us, and that's what we would ask them to do. We'd ask them to work together on their story of self, refine it, and then find a way to make their two stories of self merge into a joint story of us. 25 minutes in to after the training is done, we've developed all the materials. They now have 3 hours to work on their stories. We're there to help them, coach them, facilitate them. Ray and Jans are in tears. They've walked apart. They're in two different parts of the cafe. what's happened? We said we're not going to interfere. We're going to take a step back. We're going to allow them to come to us as they come to us. They didn't come to us. Coffees, they made their way, they talked, and before we went home at the end of the day to come back the next morning to tell our stories, they hugged. We said, oh, thank God. And this is what they came back with the next day. And I want you to hear Ray and Jan's stories. They're both very short, just 2 minutes each. And they're in Bahasa Indonesia, but they're subtitled in English. Here we go. Let's hope it works.
Nama saya Yan Spenina Daphna Pat.
Sorry, Ray first. Hold on. I was trigger happy. We're gonna hear Ray first. Here we go.
Saya bersahabat bertujuh dengan komposisi 4 Muslim, 3 Kristen, dengan suku yang unik, 3 Sumatera, 2 Jawa, 1 Cina asli dan 1 Cina darah campuran. Kami bersahabat dari single to mingle dan saling menyayangi, kami saling menyelamatkan hari raya, lalu sampai suatu hari dari kami punya anak 1, punya anak 2, dan punya anak 3. Pilkada DKI Jakarta begitu menguras energi dan emosi, dan ini terjadi di persahabatan saya. Suatu hari sahabat saya, sebutlah Mawar, mengirimkan sebuah broadcast message ke grup kami yang berkata, "Hey, semua ini salah Cina di Indonesia." Lalu saya berkata, buat apa kamu mengirim seperti itu, dengan tujuan apa? Lalu terjadilah sengit sekali dan akhirnya mereda. Beberapa hari kemudian terjadi lagi bahwa mengirim lagi broadcast message, ada ribuan orang datang ke Jakarta untuk memenangkan paslon yang Cina. Saya bertanya, tujuannya apa untuk ngirim kayak gini? Lalu terjadi persaingan sengit dan akhirnya kami berdebat dan akhirnya dia left dari grup. Dan itu ternyata membuat saya juga marah sekali sama dia. Marah banget sampai saya nggak mau ketemu. Saya meremove dia semua dari sosial media saya. Saya nggak mau lihat mukanya, saya nggak mau lihat. Tidak ada kebetulan di dunia ini, suatu hari, beberapa hari, seminggu yang lalu saya diundang membantu trainer di sebuah workshop. Dan isi workshop itu mengejutkan saya. Di akhirnya adalah, hey, memaafkanlah tanpa syarat. Kemudian workshop itu berakhir, saya kemudian pamit dan saya berlari. Saat itu hujan sangat deras banget di Sentul. Saya berlari ke mobil dalam basah-basahan. Kenapa saya sangat marah? Ternyata bagaimana saya didiskriminatif waktu saya kecil dan bagaimana tahun 98 saya bersembunyi di bawah kolong stasiun Cawang. Saya di-sweeping karena saya Cina. Saya bersembunyi sampai saya tengah malam, saya nggak tahu kemana saya mesti pulang. Nggak ada handphone, nggak ada apa-apa. Saya bersembunyi karena saya takut. Saya memaafkan orang-orang tersebut, saya memaafkan teman saya menulis surat kepada teman saya memaafkan kamu, sahabat saya tanpa tapi. Teman-teman mulailah memaafkan diri kita dan orang lain, dan itu harus dimulai dari kita.
That's Ray's story. Now I want you to hear Jan's story, and then I'll tell you what went down.
Nama saya Yan Spenina Daphna Patiwayal, saya seorang Kristiani. Saya latar belakang dari suku percampuran Ambon dan Manado. Papi saya Ambon, mami saya Manado. Nah, bicara soal toleransi, pluralisme dari segi agama itu saya kaya di sana. Saya lahir dan tumbuh besar di pemukiman yang warganya didominasi dari kaum muslim. Juga saya sekolah dari SD sampai kuliah itu di sekolah negeri. Jadi teman-teman saya memang kebanyakan dari muslim. Itu suatu hal sisi hidup saya yang buat saya bangga di sana karena saya kaya di sana. Nah, tapi rupanya suatu ketika saya menemukan bahwa ada satu sisi di hidup saya, sisi lain bahwa saya nggak seluas itu. Rupanya saya menemukan bahwa saya tidak luwes ketika saya berhubungan dengan orang yang berbeda ras, terutama yang berbeda kulit, Tionghoa. Jadi suatu waktu di sekolah menengah saya pindah ke sebuah gereja lokal. Dari sebelumnya yang gereja didominasi orang Ambon dan Nado, kali ini saya pindah ke sebuah gereja lokal yang isinya kebanyakan memang Tionghoa. Disitulah awal pertama saya bersentuhan, berhubungan langsung dengan teman-teman dari Tionghoa yang sebelumnya saya nggak pernah punya teman dekat. Itulah cerita awal proses pertumbuhan saya secara pribadi untuk saya bisa berhubungan dengan mereka. Awal-awal bahkan dalam sekian waktu saya menemukan ternyata saya mengalami kesulitan. Waktu saya berinteraksi dengan teman baru yang dengan suku-suku non Tionghoa, saya gampang gitu. Tapi dengan ketika orang yang dari Tionghoa, saya mengalami seperti sulit untuk langsung jadi satu, langsung akrab seperti ada tembok gitu. Tapi dengan mereka lah di situ akhirnya melalui pengalaman demi pengalaman, interaksi demi interaksi, kebersamaan, masa di mana justru ketika saya ada di dalam titik terendah mereka ada di sana, disitulah saya paradigma saya dibukakan dan tanpa saya sadari satu waktu saya akhirnya tembok itu yang paradigma yang selama ini saya punya itu runtuh seketika. Di situ saya belajar bahwa setiap kita hanya bisa menerima perbedaan ketika kita tinggal di dalamnya dan kita punya pengalaman baru, menemukan persamaan-persamaan di sana. Itu di situ kita akan bisa menerima apa artinya perbedaan. Terima kasih.
We'll get to Batman and Robin in a second as we near the end. Let me tell you what happened, because I think the stories are powerful in and of themselves, but something very peculiar happened. One, I would be remiss if I did not mention how much these stories resonate as I'm hearing them with the current moment that we are in with violence against Asian American and Pacific Islander peoples. This crisis and these orchestrated acts of violence are not unique to the United States, although they show up here in a very particular way. Indonesia has and the modern Indonesian state, I should say, has a horrible history of targeted organized violence against Chinese citizens of Indonesia, and basically people who are Javanese and Indonesian in language and everything, and are also ethnically Chinese and also have a connection to their own home languages. Ray, the first storyteller, is actually Muslim. He became Muslim. He's from a Chinese family. Those who were attacking his family as the government of Suharto fell apart in the late 1990s were student mobs associated with the ruling party and who were largely Muslim. Suharto sent a call out on the national radio saying it is the Chinese who are destabilizing your country, come and defend. Chinese neighborhoods were demolished in Jakarta. Women faced the most horrifying sexual violence. And someone like Ray had to hide under the bridge for a day, hoping that his mother was okay. Must be very interesting then in his own journey that he later became Muslim and married someone who's Javanese, and now works on an incredible project which invites people of different ethnic, linguistic, and religious backgrounds to live in the houses of people that are not like them for a month as children and part of the community. That's the way he directed his work. Ray is so emotional because the day that he told this story was the day after the Chinese governor of Jakarta was defeated in the election, and the entire election race was a racist, xenophobic campaign. Ahok was a good governor, well respected, a close friend of the president of the country, and yet the pernicious forces of xenophobia and ethnocentrism won the day he was later jailed for 2 years for blasphemy under really trumped up and ridiculous charges. That's the context. It was happening right there. So when Ray is also, which is interesting to me, is Chinese and indigenous, comes from 2 islands on the far-flung reaches of the Indonesian Indonesian peninsulas, you know, outside of Java, in the archipelago rather. And so he all his life faced two discriminations, one for being Chinese and one for being indigenous. Ray, on the other hand, is part of one particular indigenous community in a place called Ambon and Manado, 2 neighboring islands. She's Christian, but Ambon and Manado were the site of terrible violence between Chinese Christians, perpetrated against Chinese Christians by Ambonese and Manadonese Christians. Again, ethnic, racial violence. She was very circumspect because she's wonderful and understood her audience. She told us that basically she grew up in her church hearing hatred of Chinese people. She said she was taught hatred. She said, I was taught to hate the Chinese. And she goes, the worst kind of language was used. And so when Ray and Jan started talking and they started telling the story himself, Ray was totally triggered. He was like, and at that point, they hadn't talked about their indigenous heritage. All he knew was about that she had grown up in a family that hated Chinese. And he questioned her on it. And, there's this sense of respect. How do I speak about my parents? How do I speak about my community? I don't hold that value anymore. And that's when they had a breakdown. And then they slowly worked themselves back to each other. And Ray said, I have to listen. And she had to listen. And then this amazing thing happened. She said, do you know I'm also from Ambon and Manado? And Ray dropped. He's like, my mother and father are from Ambon and Manado. One of them is indigenous, one of them is Chinese. And they had this moment where they hugged and cried it out. And they said, what was it in our histories that allowed this to happen? And so they courageously told both these stories. And then they did a brilliant story of us where they talk about racial and ethnic stereotypes. And then they're like, we're from the same place. We speak the same language. What is separating and dividing us? Why am I taught to dislike indigenous people? Why am I? And there was this really interesting conversation around the roots of where it came from. You can imagine the crowd in the room just exploded with this joy, as the 2 of them hugged. And it opened up so many other conversations, so many difficult conversations, amongst those who were in the room. And the thing for me was, it was amazing that once we gave an opportunity for people to see themselves as not just tellers of stories, but storytellers, right? About constructing, imagining new ways. It was that third part that was so important. Yes, we can tell our own story, but then can we tell a story together? Can we pick up the pieces from each other? And that for me was just like, it was like watching alchemy. It was the alchemy of storytelling. It was like this way that all of a sudden they were weaving. Where's the connection? Where's the difference? How do we give it contour? And it was really powerful. And I saw it happen several times. And I realized that part of it was simply about honoring not only the stories that you have, but honoring the voice that is telling the stories. It seems simple. You all know this. This is not anything close to sophisticated. But it is an essential truth that is often erased and forgotten in the desire to tell better stories. We think that the stories are going to change people. We don't, I feel that I don't often realize that it is the transformative impact on the art of generating the story that is going to change someone so profoundly that their life is going to alter direction. And if your life is altered direction because you have been empowered to tell a story, you are going to be able to take that. That 150 people has now trained 3,000 across Java. You know, we still do master classes every 3 weeks for small groups of these students, Stephen and I and Ima, because we want them to continue growing. And so we're doing a series of 5 master classes on how to construct good conversation, for instance. So I think there is something about this kind of shift. Great stories, good stories, profound stories, change stories, so important. But, you know, invest in the long term. Let's build, facilitate, cultivate the storyteller. And I wonder how in our spaces of retreat, we can continue to do that. And to say continue, because I know you do it, is to do that more intentionally. So that when people leave our spaces, they not only leave with story, but they leave also with an understanding of how not only that they tell the story better, but how that they are the engine for transformation through story. That for me is like the powerful shift. So because I talk too much and I have run out of time, I'm gonna offer this to you. As something that you might like to do, and I think it's worth it. I do think it's worth sort of taking on. So what I'd love for us to think about, and I had a few of these prompts, but clearly won't get there. Is I'd like us all to think about, maybe this is our practice tonight, is to think about and tell us or tell those around you a story about a storyteller who changed, influenced, or impacted your life. You know, that's an interesting question because we often recount stories we're told. But I often think about the incredible people that I know I've met in my life and what made them a great storyteller. I know it. I know those great storytellers I met. And I know moments that I was with them, and it wasn't just the stories that we're telling, it was the way that they were telling it changed my life. Give us context, atmosphere, description of your encounter, identify the main characters of the story, all the things we do when we're telling good stories. What made the encounter so memorable? Was there a challenge that you faced out of that experience, a choice, an outcome that you might have? And so I can certainly put this in the chat as a prompt if you'd like to take that away with you. And let me just throw that in there. But maybe that's a place for us to start and to share with one another. And really find those exemplars, you know, those mentors, those ancestors, those grandmothers and grandfathers and elders who told us, or sometimes our kids, you know. I think about my son and I think about, what a great storyteller he is, 10 years old. So excited, so compelling. What does he teach me about storytelling that I often forget? He loses himself in the story, doesn't he? I love that. I love that when he's there, you know, all there. Anyways, I know you've committed 90 minutes to this time with me and us, and I really appreciate that. And my only apology is that we didn't get to more stories. I'm gonna take the easy way out and blame my Ramadan brain for not keeping track of time. But, you know, all of you, I'll throw my details. You all know how to get in touch. I'm on Mighty Networks with the rest of the team and really pleased to continue to be in touch with you. And over to you, Justine. Thank you everyone for listening and being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, AR. Just to note, he did tell me earlier that he woke up at 4:30 this morning and before that. So, and a man full of stories, and as we all are. So I'm grateful many people screenshotted and took notes and just nodded along. I know I need to go back and listen again.
I'll send through the slides to you, Justine. Very happy
perfect.
To, very happy to
I
upload
will
them
share.
on Media Networks and the other resources as well.
This was such a treat. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone. And it is just a dip of our toes into stories, and hopefully we'll have a continuation. And AR's helping the May retreat, Flourishing Together. So you'll see him again, as I hope you'll register for it. And I don't want to hold you any longer. So thank you so much and be well.
Take care, everybody.
I feel very full. Thank you so much. Don't
Thank you,
apologize at all. It was wonderful.
Thank you.